There is a phrase we use back in the country. It says, be without food, but don't be without shelter or home. Shelter is very important than food. I was working as much as you can work, like 3 jobs. Even with all of those efforts, I couldn't afford to even get a little bit time with the kids.
At the age of 16, I entered the American foster care system. I've pulled myself out of some pretty bad spots, but I needed housing, and what I was making was just not cutting it at the time.
How can a family grow and prosper if they don't have a home that they can afford in a decent neighborhood?
In the past several years, the situation has become more urgent than we've seen even 10 years ago. It has implications for people's lives.
There are so many American families that don't have enough income to afford rental housing. Half of the renters in this country are paying more than 30% of their income for housing.
The low-income housing tax credit allows investors to invest money in housing and get credits, and the result is funds to build additional low-income housing.
The Section 8 vouchers are the primary way to help people afford housing.
Vouchers are a way for a resident to get into an apartment that costs more than what they can afford with their 30% of budget allocated to housing.
There definitely would have been a lot more detours, a lot more failures, a lot more uncertainty.
Now I know that I can enjoy the life, being with the kids, and have a brighter future.
First off, I think housing is a nonpartisan issue, but I certainly believe that the bipartisan approach to solving it is what needs to happen.
Every social goal that we want for the people of the United States revolve around housing. A precondition for making progress is to have a decent place to say, tonight I'm going home to rest.
Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the Bipartisan Policy Center. My name is Dennis Shea, and I am the Executive Director of BPC's J. Ronald Terwilliger Center for Housing Policy. We are thrilled to have with us today a very distinguished guest, Dr. Seth Kaplan of Johns Hopkins University, and the author of Fragile Neighborhoods, Repairing American Society, One Zip Code at a Time. Dr. Kaplan is a leading expert on fragile states. He is a senior advisor for the Institute for Integrated Transitions, a consultant to a number of multilateral organizations, including the World Bank, and a visiting fellow with George Mason University's Mercatus Center's program on pluralism and civil exchange. Dr. Kaplan is also a long-suffering New York Mets fan, as am I. The neighborhoods in which we live impact our lives in many ways. They influence our social networks, our access to resources, and the opportunities available to us. Robust research shows that the neighborhood into which a child is born can have a profound effect on health, academic achievement, and lifetime income. In Fragile Neighborhoods, Dr. Kaplan offers an engaging exploration of social poverty and decline in America, as well as a new vision for revitalizing the communities and institutions that underpin a strong social fabric. Fragile Neighborhoods includes 5 case studies on what Seth calls leading edge social repairers, showcasing individuals and organizations who are pioneering new approaches to strengthening social institutions. The book also includes practical suggestions for those of us wishing to get involved in revitalizing our own communities. And I'm going to just show the book right here. Here it is, Fragile Neighborhoods. You should definitely purchase it, and you could do so on Seth Kaplan's website, sethkaplan.org, or anywhere where books are sold. So Seth, thank you so much for joining us. We really appreciate it.
Thank you, Dennis. It's apt that it's the day after another World Series has passed and the Mets did not end victorious. So thank you so much.
With a couple of former Mets players on the winning team.
Of course, it happens often.
Right. Well, before we really dive into our conversation, let me remind our virtual audience that if you have any questions for our guest, you can post them to our Twitter X account at BPC_bipartisan throughout the event using the hashtag BPC Live. You are also welcome to submit your questions to the YouTube chat, and we'll have some time towards the end of the event to take those questions and pose them to the Dr. Kaplan. So, you know, Seth, when we first met, you told me you were an expert on fragile states. Now, that was a new one for me, fragile states. Could you tell us a little bit about that background and what led you to start looking into the question of what causes fragility in a state?
Okay, so first, I was a wanderer before I was an expert. So I basically have been in 75 or so countries. And I basically, like a lot of people after college, I spent some time just checking out the world. And I found that I most enjoyed my time in places with strong relationships and strong local communities. The problem was those places often had unstable governments, economic problems of every sort. And I basically went to a lot of countries, and being a person who likes to read, I read everything I could about how states work or don't work. And eventually I had these dozens of countries of firsthand experience. I had worked in Africa, I had worked in Asia, I had worked in the Middle East. I had really spent a lot of time in these places. And 9/11 came, and I was looking for a way to apply my knowledge. I had done some work in business, and I really wanted to make the jump to do something on this question. Why do some states work better than others, and what are those factors? And there literally was a great need, as anyone who remembers those days, about how do we do better in fragile states, because there was a lot of discussion, but not a lot of good ideas. So that led me to write my first book, Fixing Fragile States, 15 years ago, led me to the career that you mentioned, and eventually led me, if I may just pivot there, around 2015, 2016, when there were some problems and people started getting very anxious about America because of what was happening in our elections and our politics and polarization and mistrust. People started asking me, is the U.S. a fragile state? And this book is the answer to whether I think America is fragile, and what do I mean by that?
Well, I would say the answer you give is that it's fragile, but your book is an optimistic book. That's how I took it, that there are ways to repair American society. But I was wondering if you could just sort of dive a little deeper and help us understand what constitutes a fragile state. I know you've traveled to Nigeria and Japan. I know you lived in China. You've traveled all over the world, as you mentioned. But what distinguishes a fragile state from a non-fragile state, and how do you see the U.S. sort of leaning into the fragile state category?
I think the big question we have to add, so maybe I'll take a step back and I'll answer your question. First, what is fragility? I mean, a lot of people define fragility or what makes a country fragile by looking at some technical elements, how well the government works or something like that, how well elections are run or if they're not run. I think of fragility very differently. I think of fragility as basically something to do with the way the society and the social institutions operate. So in a typical fragile state that I would work in, think Somalia, think Nigeria, think Syria, think Yemen, think Libya. And in fact, on a day-to-day basis, I work on Nigeria and Libya in particular. And all those other countries I've mentioned, I have worked on and spent time in, including Yemen, Syria, and so on and so forth. And the key issue for me is not the piece of paper that is the Constitution, not the actual functioning of specific government functions. Those are downstream from what is going on in society. And in these countries, you typically have locally things are okay because there's cohesion, but nationally there's ethnic, religious, clan, or tribal divisions. And there's no mechanism for these different parts of society to cooperate. And there's no mechanism for them to agree on what is a fair election, no mechanism for them to agree on who should hold power, how resources should be distributed. So everything in politics basically becomes a zero-sum game to trying to get hold of power and distribute resources to your own interest group or your clan or your ethnic group or so on and so forth. And you can look at the history of these countries just through that lens. I mean, the United States is different. When people ask me, is the U.S. fragile? I don't think we're fragile as a country, at least at this point in time, but we're certainly fragile if you think about fragility as relationships and social dynamics. And then you look at what has happened in American relationships over the past 2 generations, you can clearly see that something has dramatically changed in our relationships. And I could discuss that more. And whereas we used to have a lot of interpersonal relationships, local institutions, local associations, think of what de Tocqueville once wrote about what made the United States special, and what Robert Putnam wrote about in terms of what America was like of the 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s. And what you have now is there's a great absence of those. And so something has dramatically changed locally, not nationally. And that's why I led when I had to focus on this question, I focused on what has changed locally, because I think that is really what has been transformed in American life. And I think the implications downstream for social problems and politics is not well understood. And we need to go upstream to these relationships locally if we really want to look for an answer, because the social fabric affects everything else, in my opinion.
No, that's a great point. I mean, one, your book is one of those books where I constantly was underlining points that you made. But I mean, the point you just made that fragility is not measured by GDP growth or efficiency of government services. It's mentioned by social cohesion. And so I would love to hear more about how you think the U.S. might not be succeeding. And you pointed out how our levels of social cohesion have declined over the years, maybe with the rise of the internet and social media and other things. But explain a little bit more in detail how you assess our levels of social cohesion, and what are those implications for the United States as a country going forward, downstream?
So when we say social cohesion, we can look at, again, the nature of our relationships at many levels. For most of us, when we ask this question today, we're worried about political tribalism, and we're worried about what is happening nationally. We see all this data on growing polarization. We see data on growing mistrust. And I certainly think those things are important. But when I compare us to a country that's ethnically, religiously divided, think of Nigeria, think of Somalia, think of Syria, Yemen, I don't think we're anywhere near those situations, and we do have pretty strong institutions. I think, however, if you look locally and you compare what was our life like 2 generations ago to where we are now, and I do think technology plays a role, but the internet and social media is recent, and these changes go back 2 generations, 60 years or so. I think the car being a hugely important technology. I think how we built the physical landscape and the nature of our institutions almost isolate us because they're not local anymore. And everything we do is transactional through driving. So when we talk about cohesion, yes, the national matters, but we need to be much more aware of how the local affects the national. And I'll just give you 2 examples. One, we have this incredible statistic that over 100,000 Americans are dying every year from drug overdose. That is twice the number of people dying in every year than died in the whole Vietnam War over 20 years. I mean, there's many factors behind that. One is the increased supply of low-cost, very deadly drugs, but a whole nother element is the decay of the social fabric, the decay of communities, the loneliness, the isolation, the mistrust, the alienation, the lack of a social fabric or social support system that supports people where they live. If you just depend upon government, I don't think we can address the needs or the things that people used to have day in and day in their lives. So that's one example. Another example is when people are disconnected from institutions locally. Just think of what that means. Once people had a stake in their local neighborhood or their area, might have been bigger than a neighborhood. They belonged to one of these many associations. They probably belong to several associations in some form. I mean, I belong to several associations in my neighborhood, and I continue to make an effort in that respect. But most people used to have the same type of, you could call it embeddedness or attachment to these institutions, and they could actually have a sense of agency. They were connected. They had a sense of loyalty or a sense of fraternity with their neighbors, a sense of commitment to their place, and they had a sense of agency that they could improve their lives and their places, and they had a role to play as a leader, and they had a role to play in making actual change happen. Today, we mostly feel that society does things to us. We don't have these local attachments. We don't have associations we belong to. We feel very little agency in our lives. We feel we have very little practice working with other people. So we're not actually experienced in building trusting relationships. And if you have this dynamic on a large scale, which we do have today, people generally are less trustful. They're generally more alienated from what goes on in society and what goes on in Washington, which is very far away, and people feel very little influence on. And so you get this disconnection, and that affects political choices. That affects feelings. I mean, we have a strong economy. Why are so many people unhappy? I'm sure it's something to do with the level of disconnection and the level of loneliness. And that has implications in every aspect of our life, but it also leads to depression. It leads to mental illness. It leads to many social problems, such as the deaths of despair that I mentioned before. We cannot look at all of these social problems distinctively. We have to think that they're connected and they're all coming downstream from something has changed in our society and in our social fabric. And if we don't address what's happened upstream, these social problems are likely to just increase. And that, to me, is the key point that drove me to write the book.
Mm-hmm. Well, you talk about sort of five, the guts of the book are an examination of five foundational drivers of the community, being one of them being schools, family, church, physical habitat. And you talk about people who went into those communities, you call them social repairers, and actually try to make a difference in each of those specific areas. Just why don't you explain how you structured the book, focusing on these foundational drivers of the community and identifying people who are doing something to address this lack of cohesion or the decline in the social fabric in each of those areas.
The decline in our place-based relationships and community. So there was a few levels to how I chose what I focused on. First, there's a lot of books on our social problems, and I wanted a book focused on solutions. I did not want to focus a book on diagnosis or a book focused on lamenting our problems. We have plenty of books. I must have read 50 books. I have a whole bookcase. My wife doesn't want this bookcase in my living room, but I have all these books, and so they're in my living room. And we found a space, and so we don't need a book like that. So from the start, I wanted solutions. And for me, and also we have a lot of thought. I mean, this is the Bipartisan Policy Center. So there's a lot of people like you, Dennis, and others thinking about the policy question. So I wanted to be practical, and I didn't want to focus on policy. And I wanted to specifically focus, and I also didn't want to focus on economics. There's a lot of discussion about problems of economics. And I think some of the problems that I'm discussing here, they happen in materially well-off as well as poor neighborhoods. The dynamics are different. Clearly, if someone is homeless, or their school has a big problem, or there's no housing for them, or they have enough food to eat. That's a material problem. But there's a lot of people talking about material and policy, and I wanted to focus on social and what social energy could do, basically, not government directly, even though government does come up many times in my book. And so that's the starting point. Then I looked at the data on what makes neighborhoods successful. You can think of someone like Raj Chetty, who's the best expert on social mobility, and there's other people like him. You can find several scholars, 3, 4, 5 scholars that have done very good work on place-based social cohesion and social dynamics. You can also find some practical organizations that have useful data. And so I looked at that, and I decided that the 5 factors that I could focus on are 4 institutions, and 1 more something about the structural elements, the physical elements of a place. So I ended up with, and then once I had those 5, I looked for the best organizations I could find. And they're not all exact fits to the 5 categories or buckets that I started with, but they're pretty good fits. And I would say each organization, they're very entrepreneurial. Each of them have a lot of lessons. And I'm trying really hard to be bipartisan, or what I would call pre-political, non-political. So some of these are more people who are working from a perspective of the right, and some of these are more working from the perspective of the left. I have an organization, Thread, that works on interfamily dynamics, and very, very progressive, very focused on racial issues, and a few of these focus on racial issues. And they're just showing how important unconditional love is for kids to thrive. But then I have another organization focused on marriage and church. And so that might be more of a right of center approach. So the big 5 are, 1 is I would say more the physical, basically how the landscape affects dynamics in a place. 1 is, again, as you mentioned, marriage, church is like a combination. 1 is interfamily dynamics or family structures. 1 is school, and 1 is community building. And so I landed on those 5 practical, and I found 5 great organizations that we can talk about if you want.
Yeah, well, let's talk about Thread, because I was really, when I read about them, I thought that was pretty amazing, where they come in and intervene and try to find kids who don't have a family, don't have maybe a parent or a delinquent parent. And they come in and try to provide a support system 24/7, 365 days a year over a 10-year. It's a 10-year commitment to that particular kid. And I thought that was interesting. And I thought the point you make also is that you come up with some operational principles at the end of the book. The number 1 is focus on the boys, which if you want to venture into that topic as well.
So let's first think about Thread. Each of these 5 organizations, they're like a journey of a social entrepreneur. So Sarah Heminger, who founded Thread with her husband, her and her husband had this unusual time growing up. She was ostracized from her church because of something they called out about the pastor. And it's the strength of her family that enabled her and her family to get together and to persevere and end up thriving despite their ostracization and despite the problems that they faced in their own specific neighborhood. So we're talking about family being important. And then her husband's father, I believe it was, ended up in jail. Her mother got into a car crash and then had problems with addiction to some painkiller drugs and so on and so forth. And he ended up doing really bad in school and was at risk of dropping out. And who stepped in? 4 or 5 teachers from the school stepped in and basically became something like a substitute family, making sure he had everything he needed to thrive. And so what each of their experiences are showing is that place-based institutions like the family, like the school, like other local institutions are crucially important to ensuring the success of any child, any household. And so this is what I'm looking at. I'm looking at how relationships have an impact on individual, household, and neighborhoods. That's really what I'm focused on, the role of relationships and institutions. So there's 2 institutions. She went to Johns Hopkins eventually for her PhD, brilliant woman, I believe she studied neuroscience or something at some point, and she eventually graduated. But she was very lonely. Like a lot of people are materially well off. She was in this beautiful campus in Baltimore, doing very well professionally, career-wise, and yet she was lonely. She was with her husband, and she was missing something. And I think a lot of people materially well off are lonely. And she would go by every day this high school. That reminded her of her experience in high school, especially her husband's experience.
Dunbar.
And there were a lot of kids. Yeah, there's a lot of kids not doing well, different family backgrounds, lots of problems. And so she started going over looking for something to help. And eventually she settled on a model, which is what Thread does, is they were going to set up what they would call Thread families for volunteers. The volunteers might change year to year, but ideally not too much. And then a support system around those 4 volunteers based on the model that helped her husband. So she was going to try to address her own loneliness and the loneliness of other volunteers, and also address the problem that these kids, more than anything else, to thrive. And if any of our viewers or listeners have kids, what is the single most important thing that your kids need every day? Unconditional love. They need a lot of social support. They need a lot of stability. They need unconditional love. And these kids were basically in an environment which were, because of the streets, their homes, their neighborhoods felt they were lacking in many of these things, not because their parents didn't care for them, but there's a lot of instability, very toxic situation. And so her goal was to uplift these kids through a 10-year, 24/7, if you can call it 3 o'clock in the morning. If there's some problem with safety in your street, we're going to come and get you. You need help with tutoring. You need help with food, whatever you want, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week for 10 years. And it takes a long time for those kids to learn trust. They're not used to trusting people. They're not used to unconditional love. And basically what you learn is this Thread family and Thread social support system. Thread is an institution. A Thread family is like an institution. And so it's basically a set of institutions all underpinned by Thread to support people where they live in their neighborhoods in a way that is not possible otherwise. And after 10 years, the kids go from 15 to 25, and these were the worst performing kids in a not very successful school system. Average GPA, I believe, was 0.7 beforehand. And yet in the end, almost all graduate high school, and a significant percentage, I think it's like 50-60%, complete post-secondary education. And so you're basically getting a transformative result. Kids that would not get through high school, a good number of them are actually now getting through college. And so just think what unconditional love and support does to transform lives. And that's basically what everyone is trying to do in my book. Social repair is relationships based on institutions that uplift people.
Well, thank you for that, Seth. At the Terwilliger Center, we focus, of course, on housing affordability, but we also believe very strongly that you can have an affordable home, but it also is important where it's located. It should be located. We need to have more homes, more affordable homes located in communities where there are opportunities and amenities. And one of your chapters talks about the physical habitat issue of community strength or social cohesion. And you talk specifically about East Lake, which is a neighborhood in Atlanta that experienced years of underinvestment and social breakdown that resulted in high crime rates and few employment opportunities for residents. And to reverse these trends, the East Lake Foundation was created to focus on improving access to affordable housing and quality schools and employment opportunities. And I was glad to see that you mentioned in that chapter Renee Glover, who at the time was the CEO of the Atlanta Housing Authority, who's a member of our advisory committee at the Terwilliger Center. So I was just wondering if you could tell our audience more about what you learned from the East Lake experience and how important is place and the combination of affordable homes with location and place.
So if Renee watches this, so hello, Renee. We haven't met, but you are highlighted in my chapter. So thank you for your effort in Atlanta.
We'll tell her.
So we'll tell her. So I think the key point here is our government focuses is organized around function. It's organized around housing. It's organized around healthcare. It's organized around education. It's very rarely organized around place. Unless you're a small town, that's really organized around place. But city governments, you could have a government of a few million people, and there might be dozens of neighborhoods. And so this government, for the most part, doesn't measure its success by the success of places. And a good example of that is we seek more low-income housing units without thinking about what's the strategy for building them out in a way that ensures that the people who live in them live in flourishing neighborhoods. And for me, the key thing that we need to have a vision as a country that every American needs to live in a flourishing neighborhood. If we have a flourishing neighborhoods where everyone lives with an abundance of institutions and opportunities and relationships supporting them, everyone will do far better. Social mobility will be higher, inequality will be lower, loneliness will be less, we'll have far fewer social problems, and it will feed into better politics, in my opinion. So in this specific example, what you have is what was arguably the worst neighborhood in Atlanta. A very high percentage of crime in the city came out of this one neighborhood. And you had basically a philanthropist who was a real estate developer who understood the role of place. And he didn't want to just give money to lots of causes. He wanted to transform a specific place with specific people so that you could actually feel the results and see the results. And it was impossible to transform this neighborhood if you just focused on housing. It was impossible to transform this neighborhood if you just focused on schools or you just focused on any government function. The only way to transform a neighborhood on the level that he had the ambition to do is that he had to basically have a multifaceted or multi-pillar approach, in which the housing was one, but the education was another, and something to do with community institutions and amenities being the third pillar. And for the housing, it wasn't about building more low-income housing. This neighborhood had a lot of low-income housing that wasn't actually doing very well. It was about ensuring the neighborhood was mixed income and ensuring that both the middle income and the low-income housing, both of those were high quality, and that something about the percentages of middle income versus low income and the level of quality ensured that you would not have a neighborhood in which was only high poverty and disconnected from opportunity and institutions. So the idea of changing the face of the neighborhood, the ideal was that you would not be, there's a lot of turnover every year, so you want to do this in a way that doesn't drive people out. But if you build better housing and you ensure there's a really good school and you make that neighborhood go from unattractive to attractive so that there's local supermarkets, local shopping, local businesses, clubs, YMCA, if you have all of this stuff going on simultaneously, the population will grow significantly. The dynamics will change and the whole character of the neighborhood will change. And if it's done right, you do have a lot of churn in low-income neighborhoods, 20, 25%. So people are always coming and going. You're not going to retain everybody. But if you do this properly and you basically incorporate leaders from the community in your decision-making, and you work hard at how you organize and allocate housing and organize your relationship with people in the place, you can ensure that a lot of people benefit and you can completely transform the neighborhood. So it's basically, you need a neighborhood strategy. You don't need a low-income housing strategy. And I would even argue that our housing department ought to be focused on making places better. And that part of that is the housing. But if it's focused on place and not focused on housing, it will have a completely different mindset of what the goal is. And it will work with partners in a way that it doesn't work now. And I really wish our housing departments nationally and locally had different goals and thought very differently about what they were trying to accomplish.
Well, that's you made a number of very important points. One thing that I wrote down was that low income housing does not necessarily equate with low quality housing. There could be
It doesn't have to be, no.
good quality, affordable housing. That's possible to build. And building trust is also important. If you're trying to make change in a community, building trust among the residents in that community is very important. I was wondering if you could elaborate more on that, because much of your book is about how these change makers, these social repairers, how to build trust as a precondition to making advancements and making change. If you could just discuss that a little bit, that'd be very helpful.
I mean, it's interesting how this trust comes up several times, and I think probably about my 5 organizations I profiled, trust plays a role in at least 3 of them. And about negotiations, relationship development. I think the best example of that is an organization we haven't mentioned yet, Life Remodeled in Detroit. Detroit, if anyone here has been to Detroit, it's really an incredible landscape. It reminds me of some post-conflict countries. Complete neighborhoods some neighborhoods have disappeared. Other neighborhoods, you basically have some houses and fallen into repair and empty streets with only a few units left. And it's incredible, actually. And there's one social entrepreneur, social repairer there that had been doing a lot of work, organizing volunteers, cleaning up streets, repairing houses like roofs and boilers, beautifying neighborhoods, doing a lot of good work. And then Chris Lambert, and his organization Life Remodeled had an opportunity to develop a neighborhood hub. The education department of the city was basically going to move out of a middle school because of the drop in the number of students, and did not want to abandon the building and did not have money. So they gave him the building, and he thought this was a great opportunity, the most important asset in a neighborhood that had a chance of being turned around and being put on a positive trajectory. And he thought creating a hub, bringing in a lot of institutions would be welcomed, and people would just appreciate that he was doing this. And what happened was, when he announced it, people were angry with him. People were like, who are you? What are you doing coming into our neighborhood? I mean, it didn't help that he was white and he was from the suburbs or originally out of state. And these people were black. And they've had lots of experiences with whites coming in to take things from them or doing things to them. And again, this goes back to the history of racial relationships in Detroit and elsewhere. And but he also understood that, I mean, another chapter I looks at Eastern Kentucky. So it's not only a racial element. I think the racial element makes things worse, and by far. And so he basically learned that helping people, that was transactional, and that didn't need deep levels of trust to go on and help repair someone's roof or beautify their street, but to set up an organization and to basically establish yourself in a neighborhood with a long-term presence, that needed a different type of relationship with people living there. And he had to take a step back. He had to really reflect on what he had done. He had someone who was working for him at the time, was a great advisor who knew the local landscape very well. And he had to change his approach. He had to basically forget these big meetings, go literally street by street to meet people, break bread, have meals with people, spend a long time talking with people, finding local leaders that were respected in the community and going to them over and over again, eventually forming an advisory committee. He basically, instead of having his employees be from outside the neighborhood, he eventually started changed the whole feel of his organization by hiring people from the neighborhood or from a nearby neighborhood. So he changed his staff to some extent. He developed these 2 advisory bodies, one of leaders in the neighborhood, one of students, because a lot of what he was doing was targeted students. He had to change some of his plans. So the organizations he was bringing in were things that people really wanted. It wasn't supply driven. It was going to be demand driven. And he has to continuously, because there's a lot of churn in this type of low income neighborhood, 25% churn in terms of people. He has to repeat this process of building trust in many ways on an ongoing basis. But the end result of this is he developed a formula, and he learned the hard lessons that it's not about the technical. It's not always about the material. you have to have relationships. And this is all what I'm writing about. You need to have
Right.
relationships, and the stronger relationships and the stronger institutions are in every neighborhood, the more these places will be able to manage their own problems and move to a more positive direction. And the more the policy levers that we might pull in Washington will be effective. We often wonder why things aren't effective. I would say look at the nature of institutions and relationships and see how that are influencing the impact of our policies.
Mm-hmm. We have a couple of questions, Seth, from our virtual audience. First, for community organizations, what insights do you have regarding sports, youth, adult, for example, softball versus political groups, Toastmasters, Elk Club, Freemasons?
Okay, well, first, I think if you mentioned youth, I didn't quite answer your question on boys, but I mean, one reason why youth groups and groups for boys are especially important, because the data on how boys are, I mean, we all want to uplift girls and remove discrimination for girls, but in general, boys are doing much worse in among youth in our society. They're graduating from high school less, they're going to college less. There's a lot of struggling boys, youth, men. And so I believe associational life is very important, especially when it's local, especially when it's to the extent that people have agency, that they're creating these mechanisms. Or if it's a larger organization, we want local chapters. We don't want, and so sports are helpful, but I would say even more important than sports, sports are one of the few local activities that has continued strong in recent decades. Mostly everything else that's not affinity based or sports has dropped. Affinity or career or sports has declined dramatically. So to the extent that we can do local institutions that bring people together to help one another and build institutions in local neighborhoods, it's hugely important. The big question is, how do we encourage that? How do we incentivize it? I mean, I think instead of us just giving money, or instead of our government just encouraging donations to nonprofits, what would happen if we had some incentive in our policy framework to encourage giving to local institutions, local organizations? What would happen if there was some way to incentivize more volunteering? It's probably harder to quantify that in an effective manner because volunteering can take many forms. But to the extent that we don't commit to like social media and national campaigns, which we have very little impact, they're important, but we tend to have very little impact on the overall result, and instead focus on our neighbors and volunteering for local associations or starting something with a few people. In my neighborhood, I can just recall a bunch of neighbors didn't like the traffic light between where we lived and where some of the shopping, the few stores we have in our center of our neighborhood, they basically got together and did something about it. Or we worry about security, so there's a security WhatsApp group somebody organized, and there's all these different local institutions, some of them formal, some of them informal. And I think for a neighborhood to thrive, you need a lot of it, and we've lost a lot of it. So anything anyone can do, policy-wise, government-wise, you individually, the viewer, listener, I would certainly encourage. It's very important.
Seth, the other question is, your book concludes with a chapter entitled "Rethinking the American Dream." That's a pretty big, pretty heavy topic. What do you mean by that?
I mean, in terms of, again, this book, I seek to operate on two levels. So I have the 5 social repairs, and then I have 10 operational lessons. And then I conclude with what individuals can do in their lives. And I think, as I mentioned just a moment ago, that if each of our energies were directed more at local, practical people and places, instead of national, abstract, political causes, one, we would all contribute more to strengthening our country and our society. We would do more to uplift other people. We would have a bigger impact. We'd have closer relationships. So I basically call for a different kind of social engagement, a different kind of patriotism. Don't send a check far away. Look for someplace local where you can contribute. Don't just get onto social media and be angry about something. Go and look for real people you can help that are near to where you live. I think this is the way things used to be, and I think it's good for ourselves. It's good for specific people near us. It's good for the country as a whole. I think we ourselves will find more enjoyment in this, and we can wake up and say that, look what I did to help a place and help people, in a way that it's hard to say when I just send off a check or I fight for something that's far away. We need to go from the abstract to the practical, from the far away to the local, and that will quiet down our political tribalism, and it will quiet down some of the mistrust and the divisions. It will bolster us on many levels in our society.
So focus on your family, focus on your neighbors immediately, first and foremost, rather than trying to save the world. And that becomes a little bit more enriching as you live your life. You realize that these more immediate social connections, if you try to nurture them and make them grow and maybe expand them at the immediate level, that leads to a more enriching life for you. Is that sort of a
I mean, I would say it. I mean, I can think of, I can just think, I live in a neighborhood where I know a lot of my neighbors. They're not always friends, but they're relationships. I can, just last week, my wife had to rush off to help her mother get out of the hospital, went up to New York, left me with my kids for a couple of days, and I needed help. And there wasn't an app to help me. There wasn't family close by. So I had 4 different neighbors take my kids back and forth to school and keep them also after school a little bit, so I could continue with my work. And so I had 4 different people help me in those 2 days. That's like a very specific example. And I also, I mean, we talk about saving people far away. I can think of, if I know a lot of neighbors, there are neighbors that, I mean, I can't say I'm saving them, but that I have ways to contribute to them. Someone has a health issue, I can share my experience with a health issue. Someone has a need for a doctor, I can share my experience with the doctor. And so I could give 100 stories of people just helping each other a little bit every day. And that all makes our lives better. It makes our lives more fulfilling. And I personally feel like I live in a joyful neighborhood because I know people, I trust people. I have agency to contribute to people. And it's a completely different world that you will live in if you have a neighborhood where you know a lot of people, and it's joyful to walk down the streets. And I want people to imagine on an individual level how your life would be if you had that feeling every day when you were just walking around your neighborhood and seeing people around you.
Okay, we got one more question from our audience. I know we're running out of time here.
I'm all yours.
But I just thought are there differences in how to build social cohesion in rural areas versus urban areas?
Yes, for sure. Rural areas are, I mean, there's some positives and there's some negatives. Rural areas, because people are, again, it depends. Rural America is extremely diverse. It's really hard to compare 2 different places. But in general, rural areas have, as a starting point, more likely to have a culture where people will know each other and may support each other. It's not true everywhere, but because they're more isolated, there is more of in many places, a sense of together. There might be some of this culture passed down from previous times that still continues, that people are all in the same boat and they all have to support each other. On the negative side, they tend to have far fewer institutions. Just people's separation in terms of distances makes bringing people together harder. They tend to have less philanthropy, less investment, fewer density of people. So I think it's in many ways, you might have some better raw material, but harder challenges. I wrote about Eastern Kentucky. Eastern Kentucky is going through an awful time these years, and it has very few institutions to work with. So there's a greater need for people to step up and be leadership, play leadership roles, and there's possibly a greater need to bring in outside resources and to connect to places that are doing better, while at the same time remembering that rural areas need customized solutions fit to context. What works in cities will not work in rural areas. So I think the challenges are different. and that we need to think differently at times about what to do in rural areas for sure.
Yes. Well, thank you, Seth, for this really thought-provoking conversation. I just want to encourage our audience to get a copy of the book, Fragile Neighborhoods, Repairing American Society, One Zip Code at a Time. It's a great read, some really important insights. So I want to thank you, Seth Kaplan, for being with us today at this webinar. I just also, for our audience, want to extend an invitation to join our next webinar on November 7th at 1 p.m. Eastern Time, which will cover the topic Aging Without Housing, Addressing the Rising Tide of Senior Homelessness. So thank you, Seth. Thank you, audience. See you next time. Have a great day.
Thank you, everyone. Feel free to reach out. Take care. I think I got cut off.